The Jetsons, Charlton, Issue 10. Judy tells George she's going to visit her grandmother, and this gets me excited that I'll be able to see her. George is asleep when his family leaves. Rosie moves his armchair to another room out of the way, and ends up having a party with a bunch of other robot friends that she somehow had the time to make when she just works as a maid all day, every day without the internet. All of them are pen pals. They dance to a jukebox playing a bunch of noises. Wild robots, programmed by humans, think of that as music and not real music, when it's only going to make their human masters think it's an earthquake. Some cops with clubs go up to the robots because I guess a neighbor complained about the noise. And the story ends there. So many of these stories lately feel like they end in the middle. But it also seems like if they continued after that, it'd just be predictable what would happen next, as it ends right after getting all of the interesting stuff done. Then there's a page where Jane's friend she suddenly has walks away from her. Based on Jane referencing in the 60s comic that she gossips with the neighbors, I'm assuming she's friends with them for that reason. But it's still jarring because I never see her with friends. Jane finally explains why she's happy to be with George. Because he's always neat. George is thankful that he got to go home early, and Jane plans on getting her friend to meet him. So now I have to assume she just moved next door, with the story not bothering to explain that somehow. The story ends with her being upset that George doesn't have a shirt on, and is in his boxer shorts in front of them while cleaning the car. There's no reason he'd be casual instead of embarrassed, and no reason he'd wear that silly hat. It's an out-of-character moment for a joke. In the next story, Jane says George looks tired as she gets served coffee automatically, and cares enough to tell him to see a doctor for a checkup. It's too bad it's not explained why George thinks he's a quack, because it seems forced. He says he's late for work, crawls under the secretary's desk in a failed attempt to avoid being spotted, and basically wants to talk to George about a contract for some reason, only for George to somehow start napping when you don't go to sleep that fast. So it basically tells people to carry George to the car and have it drive him home automatically. Rosie reveals that she doesn't get much sleep these nights either, so I wonder if she's been keeping them up with her noisiness. But why wouldn't the entire family be kept up then? Jane hears mumbling when trying to sleep, but this time George can sleep just fine because he was already tired. He tells Jane to put the morning news on because it'll wake him up, and the news warns them to watch out for burglars. George jumps to the conclusion that the noises he had been hearing were people trying to break into his house because he has no other ideas. He decides to come up with a burglar alarm in his workshop. So finally, the comic writers are writing him as talented with technology again. And eventually, because George insists on going to investigate the noises he hears before the burglar alarm went off, and Jane presses the button for it because somehow it wasn't set to activate automatically in response to an intruder, he gets picked up by robot claws and tied up upside down, which could have easily not happened. It's refreshing to see Rosie wearing clothes, other than her typical French maid outfit. But why would she bother? She wears pajamas just because everyone else does. It turns out she woke him up in the first place because of her late night movie watching. In the next page, surprisingly, it turns out Judy did the dishes for Jane by hand because this is another universe where they don't have a dishwasher. She must be doing this as a punishment. It turns out Elroy was helping her wash them with a scuba mask on in the sink. How'd it be that deep? In the next story, George decides to drive to a small planet that wasn't on his chart, making me assume it's a very recent artificial planet. Somehow, George thinks it's safe to leave the car without an astronaut suit and gets away with it and no one calls him out on it. George jumps to the conclusion that he's the first person to set foot on this planet, and Jane doubts him as usual without explaining why. Elroy says someone's been here before, and the piece of paper has to be written by either a joker or someone who has the same name as Christopher Columbus by coincidence. It's too confusing a joke to end the story on. so I wish it explained it instead. I wanted to know more about this planet and have an actual plot on it, but it's so short that it's pointless. In the next story, Sam shows Elroy's voodoo doll of George, and George sits on a tack that happens to be on the armchair. I have to assume it's Sam using his witchcraft again to summon it. Something falls on George's foot, as I wonder why Sam thought Elroy would want him to do this. And Elroy explains why he thought he could get away with it because he clearly doesn't care and just smiles, asking to try himself. All he wants to do is tickle the doll to make him laugh, making me wonder why he was cool with them hurting his father if he doesn't want to himself. And George hears them and is made to laugh. And the story ends with them harshly punishing Elroy, who's somehow wondering why, when sure he wasn't the one who used the doll to hurt him, but it was his friend that he invited that did it. So it's sort of his responsibility. George knows the voodoo doll works already and that's why he's punishing him. But he's not really acting like how people usually do when they're laughing. So it comes off like he's only fake laughing, to make fun of him. But he must have been laughing for real at first. Sam doesn't tell Elroy that tickling the doll doesn't ever do anything, and instead assumes it's what makes him laugh. In the next story, a fortune teller tells Judy something will happen using a crystal ball. George says they're all safe predictions, but what's not safe is saying all of them at once, quadrupling the chances that they won't come true and she'll be considered a liar. I'm guessing they will come true because it's a work of fiction. George lampshades that he doesn't know why he let Judy take him to a fortune teller. But at least with this lampshading I can figure out the reason. That he just wants to humor his daughter. Somehow, George crashes into a car, which makes no sense because he was facing the front of him. So it must have been the other guy's fault. Because I don't see why George would have been looking to the left before Jane told him to look out, when it seems like he only looked to the left to look at her for saying that. The story ends with a prediction coming true because George is paying for the car accident and not him somehow. And so I wonder if it's realistic that these two aren't flattered at Judy complimenting their looks. In the next story, George gets handed a helmet from an inventor that turns him invisible, as he conveniently managed to meet him off screen. But the button gets stuck somehow, keeping George from using it to go back to normal. I have to assume soda was spilled on it, but that would have been nice to know. The guy the writer was too lazy to name pokes George's eye trying to hit the button, which makes no sense unless glass from the helmet fell off somehow. So eventually, George makes Jane faint by talking to her, and the inventor tells George to give the button a half turn as he's holding blueprints for it. How can you give a button a half turn? The inventor is still brave enough to want to try it himself after this. The button gets stuck halfway, making him half invisible, and George says, "Here, I'll walk you halfway to the door." In the next story, Elroy wants to explore another planet his family's visiting to see what the wildlife looks like. I guess it doesn't have internet access, so he can't just Google it. He follows some tracks while assuming the animal from them is going to be harmless, and eventually they get scared by seeing something breathe fire in a cave, which unfortunately is too dark to show us what it looks like. So that's lame, because the whole story was based around him trying to see what the wildlife looked like. George kind of meant it when he said he was going to leave them here, because it'd be illegal and his family wouldn't let him. He was just trying to scare them. In the next story, Jane calls George at work like it's nothing in front of his boss to tell him to pick up a few things on the way home. I like that he plans on finding bargains to show her how to save money. Spacely looks unusually friendly for once by laughing and admitting that he spends too much every time he goes shopping and gets in trouble with his wife. He has no reason to admit that, but I'm glad he's in a good mood. I wouldn't expect him to be better with money than his smart boss. Him being better with money fits with the stories where he was cheap. George has a repetitive panel where he looks forward to saving money again, which makes me wonder if he's gonna end up spending too much for a failed attempt at a joke. He sees a ton of stuff, being impressed by their low prices, and buys them, wanting to impress her with the bargains. The story ends with Jane serving him nothing for dinner, because a hamburger cooked in a grease somehow, despite being sold in a store. The peas shriveled up, despite being sold in a store. Just confusingly, the potatoes were not worth cooking. The dessert somehow turned to water and none of the songs match. That's depressing and confusing, so it doesn't seem fair. It is true that in some stores, if you see a whole bunch of stuff all at once, you're more likely to assume that it's a bargain, but they do that on purpose, and that doesn't mean the stuff is actually valuable. So they should have done something like that. If they did it realistically, at least that'd be educational. The Jetsons, Charlton, issue 11. George cares enough to ask Jane what's the matter, and she and Rosie tell him the new rocket vacuum is broken, and all the repair stores are closed today. He plans to fix it, even though Rosie doubts he could, because it has computers and rockets. While I could believe there'd be a limit to what he could fix, it's still annoying to have a story that doesn't acknowledge that he can be good at fixing things and lies to you that he always sucked at it. Too many panels happen before he hands the vacuum to her. It's way too predictable that it doesn't work well. Elroy's supposed to be the bungling inventor. Rosie complains while flying around with it that instead of sucking air in, it's pushing out like a motor. He's actually clever enough to realize that this will propel his old space car and be right. Why would he ever put it in reverse and make it suck up all of the garbage below him? It's really annoying that he says it's a flop because of that, when he could have very easily never made that mistake again. I can understand him putting his car in reverse to park, but that'd be a different mechanism entirely from putting the vacuum in reverse, because there'd already be a lever in the car to let him put it in reverse that he'd use instead. Thankfully, a garbage truck driver offers to buy George's new vacuum car, and gets a lot of money for a new vacuum. I'm glad the story didn't keep pretending it was a flop, and instead acknowledged him for his talent after all. I'd expect Elroy to be the character in the Jetsons with a story where he's a gadgeteer, but because George's invention worked out, this is refreshing and more believable because he's an adult, and way more needed considering what an idiot he's usually portrayed as. But it's dumb that he calls the dollar bill a check. In the next story, George tells his family that his cousin Homer is coming to visit the family, which makes him upset. He's from a planet called Outer Venus. Why did they let him visit if they hate him? Judy explains that Homer can make himself invisible. I hope we're not supposed to believe this is because he's not human, because it'd be impossible for him to be related to George that way. It was already really stupid that they had a cousin that was an alien in the show. I'm gonna assume he's a warlock instead. A descendant of warlocks, so that he only has one power. He says that's an ability that the people from Outer Venus are born with. He almost looks human, except for the tiny antennas on his head. I can still explain how he's human and just a descendant of witches though. Witches who settled on Outer Venus hide the existence of witches by having their non-full-blooded descendants wear antennas, to make it look like they're aliens when they're not. It's too bad the writer thought to have Elroy ask him how he can go invisible when he just has Homer say he doesn't know. It's too bad Jane gets knocked over by him. He apologizes to his cousin, and to George when George sits on him when he's lying on the armchair. I have to assume that he's invisible by default, and can only stay visible for a small period of time. But since that'd be chaos for society, I'd like to think he's either sick or terrible at handling his power. The former would make more sense. Elroy gets an idea to get Homer to leave. The family pretends to not see Homer, who decides to leave and see his doctor. And Elroy gets given cake while George calls him smart. In the next story, Astro has no excuse for howling when the family's trying to listen to Elvis's concert on TV because he's got human intelligence. I don't know how Jane is so patient that she's smiling while telling him to be quiet, and George is smiling too. Elroy tells Astro to come with him so that he can give him singing lessons. At first he can't do it, and then gets an idea, and seems to be doing an inventor thing in a comic finally. He asks his parents if they're ready to hear Astro sing, and he actually sings until the record concealed in his collar stops. Why would Elroy think that solved his problem? Astro wasn't singing at all. In the next story, it takes place in a different universe where George has a different boss with white hair. It's sloppy to not explain how this is the case right away, but whatever. He trusts George to take a bag of money to his factory on the terraformed Saturn. George heads for a space bus to it and says he'll carry the bag instead of checking it. Which makes sense because he was told not to screw up, and would feel safer protecting it himself than hoping he gets it back from someone else. A bunch of glowing eyes stare at him from behind in the dark somehow, but then he asks what they're stopping for. So that panel didn't mean what I thought. A robber gets on the bus threatening people with guns to get their money. You'd think he'd wear a full face mask. George gets threatened and somehow has to think about whether he'd prefer to be killed or hand over $20. He really hates his life because of Jane. I don't know if it's believable that the robber asked him what's in his bag when he already got handed the money from his wallet. So most people would assume there's no money in the bag. George says it's his lunch, at least trying to lie. The robber says he's hungry and wants it anyways. George throws it at his head, making him drop the gun from the pain and get dazed. He won by catching him completely off guard by saying catch and throwing the bag of money at him when he was too confused by the word to pull the trigger. I guess the fact that human reaction times aren't the best justified him surviving perfectly. But he was still surprisingly brave to even try it. The robber would have succeeded if he had brought a friend with him with another gun. But it's far more believable that he didn't have any friends. George tells his boss the payroll is delivered. And sadly, somehow his boss tells him that he was goofing off because of the newspaper picture. Even though the headline calls him a hero and the article would have explained why. It made it clear that this happened on the space bus to Saturn, so he had to do this. I'm glad he doesn't punish him, because that would have made it matter. Also, he finally dyed his hair black from white, but that still doesn't make him look like Spacely. In the next story, Elroy tells his family to stop on the terraformed Saturn and picnic there. And Jane asks George if he's sure it's safe, making it too obvious that it might not be. So why does he think it'll be safe if she has to be saying this for a reason? George ends up throwing a football into a bush. It turns out a giant chicken's trying to hatch it, mistaking it for an egg. Which it has absolutely no excuse for because we see its egg. George figures out how to get his football back by rolling the egg downhill to make the chicken chase after it. Which somehow works, even though the chicken would think that the football is her egg. There's a comedy page where George asks the computer where to fish and what kind of bait to use. Somehow he gets punched by a boxing glove that wouldn't be put in it. Instead of being told his answers, he's told that he has chores to do first. That wouldn't happen. It's not like Jane is a programmer who could make the computer like that. Although she did say she computered Rosie to know how to date a boyfriend. So I guess in this comic she is a programmer. In the next story, George doesn't like the idea of Jane buying expensive perfume. So he decides to make it himself with a perfume book and Elroy's chemistry set. At least he's trying to use his brain again. Regardless of his common sense level, I'd gladly take that over characters never doing that. He gets surrounded by gas and opens a window, and somehow there's an explosion behind him damaging the house. I don't buy it, because he had the exact instructions for what to do, just like last time. And last time he only had exact instructions for all but one. The story could have served a good purpose by realistically showing why you shouldn't try to do what George did. Instead, he has a smart idea and gets punished because a jealous writer forced it to go wrong. In the next story, for once we see Sam have a real soft side instead of being evil by giving Elroy a giant present. He thanks Sam, and it turns out he got an invisible box made from a rare metal from Mars. Oh, so he only got it so it would cause problems. Because he can't enjoy himself with it. So Elroy really is polite to actually appreciate it. After some padding, George walks towards it and trips on it, which is frustrating because despite being called invisible, it's a white square surrounded by black lines, so it looks like you should have seen it. Why did Elroy put the box down in his path if he didn't want him to trip on it? He would have put it in his room in the closet. He would have moved the box out of George's way. Why did Sam give it to him if it does nothing when he could give him a gift from the heart that looks better and won't cause problems, or give him something that does something. He thinks it'll be considered a good gift just because it's a gift. Elroy doesn't care about George tripping very much, because when he's told to take it away, he says that if he said it's not there, he can't take it away. And Jane thinks the whole family is going crazy, when it'd be much more likely that only she was. The first story is some mundane plots where Rosie throws a party when George is asleep, and the only way it takes advantage of it being in the future is that they somehow listen to music that sounds like an earthquake because they're robots. I don't feel like it's in character for Rosie to throw a party at her house. The second story, after a lot of padding, as George sees the news and think that the mumbling keeping him and Jane up at night is from burglars failing to break in. So finally the comic remembers that George is good with technology, because he makes his own burglar response system. That made the story worth it, even if it was annoying that it was used on him because of Jane. The fact that Rosie was a culprit was given away with the foreshadowing, but I'm so glad it wasn't burglars. After a story where George lands on an uncharted planet that someone else found first, and the story ends before anything could happen, there's another story where some use the George voodoo doll to get him hurt a lot. Then there's the story where George crashes into a car somehow and has to pay for it, with it being annoying because it's too vague about how that even happened. And that was written to happen to him to reflect the prediction of a fortune teller. You'd think that she would have warned him to drive very carefully today. Though he would have crashed anyways if it was his fault for becoming a distracted driver by complaining about her while driving. This wasn't taking advantage of the sci-fi environment. Just like the previous story, it doesn't have to be the future for a voodoo doll to work in a cartoon. The next story did take advantage of sci-fi by having an inventor make George invisible, but I wish it was explained how his button on the helmet got stuck. It's more refreshing that he's the one who invented something that fails, not Elroy. Because usually when Elroy's making inventions, he sucks at it in the show. There's another story where Elroy wants to see what aliens on other planets look like just to get scared by one with fire breath, which is just disappointing because we don't see what it looks like, and it's the only alien. The final story is Jane get mad at George because the stuff he bought for cheap sucked, despite a promising beginning that reminded us how smart he was for wanting to buy bargains. And what I hate about the ending is that it doesn't seem believable that everything he bought sucked so badly when it was being sold in stores. Also, this has to be another universe because here he can buy cookie ingredients just fine, and she tried to cook them to get her meals. The first story looks bad and boring at first because George insists on trying to fix a complicated vacuum despite being told not to, but it gets way better because he thinks to turn his failure into a success before propelling his car. Even when he makes the vacuum suck up garbage when he has no excuse for putting the vacuum in reverse, it impresses someone enough to get him money from it. It went from looking like a cliche story about how you should never do it yourself, to one that actually acknowledges how smart George is with technology for once. But you'd think it would be Elroy in this position. But George is so stupid that it's refreshing. The second story has a cousin of Jane visitor who spends nearly the whole time being a problem because he's invisible, just because he's an alien with almost no excuse for being related to her. So I think it's a fake alien who's really a descendant of witches. It's confusing because he's not bothering them on purpose. It only makes sense if he was, so I don't know why they are being bothered. I just have to assume he's unable to stay visible for more than an instant, which just isn't logical. I wish it was simply explained that a witch cursed him to be this way, or better yet, he has a sickness. I like that Elroy's plan worked to make him look smart. The whole story was interesting and creative enough, but never should have happened because the family would have forbid him from visiting a long time ago. The third story has Astro to start howling when the family is trying to watch TV for no reason, and Elroy somehow decides to give him, a dog, singing lessons for no reason, until he gets the idea to make it only look like Astro is singing until the record in his collar stops. So apparently he was only happy about it because he liked the idea of fooling his family, when I thought he just wanted to help Astro actually learn to howl in a way that sounds nice. The only way he could teach him how to sing. And it never would have happened in the show where Astro can talk. The fourth story has George have to bring some money somewhere on a bus to Saturn. The only thing sci-fi about the story that was necessary to explain why he'd ever be on the bus instead of driving. And I like that he foils the robber. In the fifth story, George plays catch with Elroy and throws the football into a bush. And because it's an alien planet that shouldn't be called Saturn, there's a giant chicken sitting on it because she somehow mistook it for its egg. And I'm proud of George for thinking of a plan to get his football back. But the plan shouldn't have worked because if the chicken thought she was sitting on her egg already, she went to see the actual egg and realized that what she looked at before wasn't it because of how it looks if her vision's bad enough for a member of her species to mistake a football for an egg. The sixth story punishes George with an explosion to his house for trying to make perfume with the chemistry set, which is an over-the-top punishment from the writer for not giving $60 in 70s money to a store. I hate that it's not explained how he screwed up when he had instructions. So it looks like a brilliant idea of his seems just forced to go wrong. It doesn't show us why we shouldn't try this. Too bad he couldn't just Google how to make perfume even though it's the future. Again, what does this have to do with it being the future? In the seventh story, of all the gifts Sam could have given Elroy for his birthday, somehow he chooses an invisible box over a good gift that doesn't require a rare metal. Elroy's too sentimental and polite to not enjoy it, and somehow he puts it in George's way when he could see it coming from a mile away that George would be walking towards it. And instead of just moving the box out of the way of him, he warns him, so he doesn't believe him. Why does he think Elroy's a pathological liar in this comic? It's not like Sam got the box specifically so George would trip over it, because he looks more concerned than Elroy when he does.